History and Sociology of Science and Technology at the National University at Colombia. His interests include the history of Colombia itself, science and technology and imperialism, quantitative methods, and science and modernity. Alexis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kostas, and thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. It's a real privilege. I'm going to follow a tradition in some parts of the world. In other parts, it's not very welcomed, which is I'm going to read. So we have been invited to the present, to present, we have not been invited to present results of our research projects, but to make a statement, even to provoke the audience. That's the invitation we received, and that is what I'm going to do in the following minutes. I have listened to several of the presentations since yesterday at this festival. The meeting point of most of them is a concern for the present, and it couldn't be different for two reasons. First, it is true, as Norberto Bobbio said when referring to the state of health of democracy, that it always seems to be in crisis. But it is also true that today there are worrying signs of a catastrophe. Indeed, some historians wonder if there are parallels between the current situation and that between the First and the Second World Wars. This brings me to the second reason of our political concern. We are participating in an event of the Division of the History of Science and Technology, which is part of the International Science Council, whose origin we can trace back to the famous Congress of the History of Science in London in 1931. Nazism had not yet emerged in Germany. The Spanish Civil War had not begun, but the winds that blew were a mixture of concern and crisis. The world could succumb to the fascist temptation or to a bright socialist future. That was the vision, not only of the immense Soviet delegation that participated, but also of the organizers, all of them committed to socialism. J.D. Bernal, J.B.S. Haldane, Lancel Hodgman, Hyman Levy, and Joseph Needham. All of them knew that the world situation also required the decisive participation of scientists and historians. In fact, the central session of that Congress was Science at the Crossroads, which denotes the sense of urgency and significance of the meeting. The following years only served to continue incubating the serpent's egg that Ingmar Bergman crudely showed in 1977, this famous movie. It is not unusual to live in a perpetual apocalyptic feeling, and I have to say that I am a pessimist by nature. I'm sorry. Yet I think that in this case, we are at a defining crossroads for humanity. Yes, colleagues, with those grandiloquent words that seem to come from a political and not an academic discourse, I said, the current political situation, both in the global north and the global south, is terrifying. The strengthening of the far-right movements in Germany, Spain, Italy, France, Hungary, El Salvador, the United States, Argentina, Brazil, you name it. For this reason, our profession is constantly interpelled by the newspapers we read every morning. For this reason also, I believe that we ask ourselves what to do. And one of the answers we give ourselves is to contribute to political education as a political action. These words are then a provocation. because they have a political tone and meaning. Have no doubt about that. I don't mean to hide my intention. I'm not driven by a personal motivation, but also by the mandate of UNESCO, one of the institutions that shelters us today. Indeed, we make history of science and technology because we aspire to promote peace and democracy. In order to justify our professions as historians, we have written upon entire forests. We can convince our funders that and donators that our discipline is very important because of its potential. But have we been effective in developing that potential into action? We actually don't know. I suspect that we have not asked that question. Furthermore, we have tried. We haven't tried to find it out. Maybe we have to maybe because we are afraid of discovering a naked king, which is ourselves. We have a long tradition of authors who conceived their work in a political key and even as political action. The works of Lewis Mumford that began at the first half of the 20th century, those of Langdon Winner in the 1970s, or Harry Collins and Trevor Pinch within the framework of social construction of technology, and David Edgerton and David Nye in this century, to name a few examples, have made it clear to us that we can contribute and maybe must, that we should be taken seriously if we want to live in democratic societies. Philosophy of science, of technology, since its origins in Germany, Spain, and the United States, has been interested in the relationship between democracy and technology. So there is a lot of inspiration out there. For the part, educators and political scientists have argued quite convincingly that democracy is a system of government that must be learned. As John Dewey claimed, it is a way of life, of building ties with our fellow citizens. Therefore, we must educate ourselves politically to be able to participate actively and responsibly in the public sphere. The third consideration that I want to bring to the table before making a proposal is this. All decisions concerning fundamental rights contain a technological component at their core. Indeed, in order to exercise any human right, some infrastructure is required: access to information, education, drinking water, freedom of expression, etc., from pipelines to roads. Hence, we have an important role in the political education of citizens, not to mention leaders and technocrats. The question that has been hunting me for a long time now is whether we have really been able to move the public agenda in any way or help to empower citizens to participate in decisions that involve technology. In other words, do we exercise our commitment to public use of history of technology? Even more crudely, I want to make a call to move from our self-justification to concrete proposals and interventions. There are many experiences, almost all of them, fortunately, experimental, uncertain in their results, flexible, open. Citizen laboratories such as those developed by Media Lab in Madrid, Media Lab de Prado in Madrid, have been inspired actually by the theoretical and practical work of historians and sociologists of science and technology, such as Antonio Lafuente and Alberto Corsin. From Latin America, Africa, and Asia, participatory action research has been developed at the community level since the 1960s. Chilean economist Manfred Max Neff and his collaborators have proposed and applied human-scale development methodologies. So my proposal within the framework of the DHST and following its mandate within UNESCO is the following. One, Let's build a reasoned directory of public use initiatives from the history of science and technology, which is useful for teachers, social leaders, and activists. And I insist, public use of technology and citizens to develop methods of participation in the public sphere. Let us spread it widely as an intervention strategy in political pedagogy environments. 2, let's take a stock of the initiatives that through the public use of the history of technology and working with civil society, local, national, and regional governments, as well as educational systems, so that we would have elements to know if we have been effective or not, and why. It is, therefore, an exercise in reflexivity that takes us to my last point. Let's build a manual of good practices for public use of the history of science and technology, but not for specialists, but for citizen political education. And to do that, let's make use of one of those methodologies. This is another exercise of reflexivity. Finally, let's create a committee that designs this strategy and that contains not only historians of science and technology, but also communities to create spaces for co-production of solutions to specific problems that involve science and technology, for one side, and resist the temptation to the authoritarian solution that is coming. In broader and surely vague terms, I invite us to face this simple and simultaneously difficult question and look for answers. Who is our most relevant audience in times of crisis? Can we feel satisfied with speaking and writing to our colleagues only? There are many reasons to answer positively to that question, but there are also many others to recognize that there is some or a lot of hypocrisy in our public statements about the importance of what we do. It is time that, as in the origins of this institution, we stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway just wrote about. Again, we stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway put it, in these times of crisis and unrest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Surely we'll have a lot to discuss about at the end of the session. Karine Chemla is the next speaker, is a researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS. Her work focuses from the historical anthropological viewpoint on the relationship between mathematics and the various cultures in the context of which it is practiced. Karine has co-edited a number of books. One is with the late Evelyn Fox Keller, titled Cultures Without Culturalism, The Making of Scientific Knowledge. And another one is Cultures of Computation and Quantification in the Ancient World. Karine, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Kostas, and thanks to Alexis for having launched the discussion in a way that is in line with what I'm going to speak about, even though in a very different way. But I wouldn't like to begin without thanking Lisbeth Demol, Thomas Haddad, the DHSC Council in general, as well as Sam Robinson, Daniela Makahe, and Alexander Stoyer for their help in setting up this wonderful event. This is really something that is promising for the future. And this is the beginning of building a future together. So many thanks to them. The general theme of our festival is the future of the history of science and technology. And I've been nominated by YASCUD, the International Association for Science and Cultural Diversity, to say a few words about the future of history of science and technology. And I will take this issue from the viewpoint of how, as historians, we want to deal with collectives of actors, how we might want to deal with the diversity of ways of practicing science and technology, to deal with the diversity of bodies of knowledge in science and technology. The question is important for exactly the same reason as Alexis has put forward in his talk, because there are ways of dealing with collectives in relation to science at the present day that are disturbing. Indeed, in various types of political discourses around the globe, we hear talks in terms of science with, and then you can add whichever name of nation you like, characteristics. Any kind of religion you would like to put science, an adjective added to science. Science of, you plug any name you think of, civilization and culture. In other words, we face political uses of the history of science and technology in relation to the shaping of community. The point is that these representations of entities of this kind usually draw on our work as historians. And here we have a political, an ethical, a scientific responsibility that we need to confront. Indeed, when we read our colleagues, we find that very often historians of science associate elements of knowledge, scholarly practices with nations, cultures, people, civilizations, and other types of communities. Why, on which basis do they practice this kind of association? I think this is a question that we need to ponder, because this practice has an impact on the historiography we produce, and as I just pointed out, far beyond. The question is far too large to receive a general answer, but I would like to illustrate the problems with this way of practicing history of science that puts itself in the context of a national framework, what people usually call, I will suggest another way of dealing in the context of Yaskud, with cultural framework and so on. I would like to point out an example that I will take very simply from the history of numbers, simply because this type of account flourishes when we hear speak of Hindu arithmetic, Egyptian multiplication, and so on. Let me just show you very briefly the way in which a book about numeration system is written. We have chapters about Mesopotamia, chapters about China, chapters about India, and so on. So the framework is, in fact, nation states or entities of this kind. This is the summary of the book, some chapters of which I've projected. And you see that although the author wants to classify types of numeration system, this is what the classification is about. If you look at the leaves, you see peoples, you see nations, Egypt, Aztecs, Greece, Rome, Sumer, and so on. And the arrows, the horizontal arrows you see, are arrows of progress within a people. So the whole history of number is structured within frameworks that are borrowed in political discourses to shape collectives in the way I started with. This is not by chance. Here is a statement that Charles Morazet, a historian of the Annales School, writes in introduction of the book by Geneviève Vittel, whose summary in the form of a tree I have shown you. Historians and mathematicians, he writes, we learn in this book the solidarity of number and cultures of which they are the most rationally analyzable elements. To know how a people counts is also to know what it is. So this, I think, highlights how Morazet, but many other people since then, by the way, Morazet, in the context of UNESCO, of which we spoke a moment ago, Morazet considers as relevant, the communities he considers as relevant for the history of science and technology, and you see a direct echo with the political discourses as I began with. You also see how he uses history of science and technology, numbers in this case, in the making of community. So this is, I think, what highlights the ethical and scientific responsibility of the historians. The ethical question for me is, are we certain that these are the relevant frameworks for numbers and for any kind of topic? I have chosen numbers as an example. This is the ethical question that we need to ask ourselves. But also from a scientific viewpoint, what do we lose when we use a framework of this kind? I think I would like to show that when we shape our histories in a framework of this kind, we foreground the question of systems of numeration as being shaped within or as being a contribution of an entity of this kind that would then circulate to other entities of this kind. Whereas, in fact, what we see in the sources is completely different. Indeed, let me take Chinese and Sanskrit sources and later Arabic sources where we have what we call the place value decimal system, the one that when you write 1, 2, 3, 4 means that the 1 means 1,000, the 2 means 200, the position gives the value. Well, until the 9th century, everywhere where it is alluded to, it is only used and practiced on material supports. It is never used for linguistic expressions in text. It is always used for the same operation. It is used on configuration of the same type through formal multiplication. And then after the 9th century, all of a sudden, in Chinese, Sanskrit, Arabic sources, it begins featuring in writings as figures. So we have so many echoes and so many continuous echoes through time that it's difficult to imagine that we do not have there communities that are, in fact, cross-linguistic. But these communities that are cross-linguistics, they are not thinkable if we begin with a framework that starts from nation, linguistic groups, and so on. This is how my colleague Charles Burnett pointed it out when he said that this system is in fact independent of language and was shared by actors writing in Sanskrit, Arabic, that they shaped a community that was trans-linguistic. I insist something that a framework in terms of nations and other communities would prevent us from thinking. But there is more, because if we have, with this way of dealing with number, a cross-linguistic type of knowledge, cross-linguistic practices of number and computation, it is only with this numeration system that we have cross-linguistic. And this arithmetic knowledge is in fact only the knowledge of specialist groups. There are other social milieux writing in Chinese, for instance, who are practicing computation completely differently with other numerical signs and in ways that seem to have been confined either in China or in Sanskrit and so on. So if I turn to the kind of diversity that we want to describe and that Yaskud wants to promote, it is not a diversity in terms of Chinese culture, European culture, and the like, but if I speak about number and computation, a social and global history of computation that would shape collectives on the basis of the documents, no matter what the language they are written is, and that would bottom up look at the social milieus, some of them within those writing in Chinese, some of them cross-linguistic milieus. So these are the types of cultures of computation that we can find when we start from the documents and we shape collectives. In these types of cultures of computation, we will find that some of them are translinguistic, specialized knowledge, others are not. So this is a call also for the future of the history of science and technology, a call for a common reflection about our practices, because our practices leave their mark on political discourses, and we may want to understand how, and we may want to fight with our work against representations of collectives that were shaped with our work, but that we should not have shaped if we had looked at the sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine. I think it was a talk complementing very much to what Alexis has already talked about. We now have Hermann Hanger. His talk is titled Responses of Science to Crises. He's a professor emeritus of Assyriology at the University of Vienna, but he has held positions at the German Archaeological Institute in Baghdad and the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. He's also a member of the American Philosophical Society and the Austrian Academy of Sciences, where in fact he chairs the Commission for the History of the Natural Sciences. Hermann, you have the floor.
Thank you. Before I start, I have to apologize. I had to compile this presentation at 1 week's notice. Therefore, you will not hear anything of my personal research, but rather some general statements, actually on crisis, yes, from my country. So, currently, the world has to face crises in all directions of different importance and urgency. Some of these, like wars, are caused by identifiable persons, but affect innumerable others who were not asked whether they would agree to these actions. Other crises arise from human behavior, but the people causing them are not conscious of the connection between their behavior and the catastrophic results. The most obvious are the climate-related problems, which even by now are recognized by many, but still not by all. People often say, what can I, a single powerless human being, do against these global dangers? They expect solutions from their politicians, and rightly so, because these were elected, wherever this is possible, these were elected to solve problems too large for single persons. Being a politician, however, does not by itself make one knowledgeable about how to deal with far-reaching crises. In this situation, many expect help from scientists to explain causes and propose possible solutions. The relations between politicians and scientists can, however, quickly become difficult. The Austrian Academy of Sciences is aware of this because they are asked sometimes for advice from politicians. Conversely, members of the Academy may feel that they have to give important advice in politics. To confront the current issues between politics and science, and under the impression of the manifold misunderstandings and disagreements that occurred during the corona pandemic, the Austrian Academy, together with the German National Academy of Sciences Leopoldina, recently published a series of statements on this topic. I paraphrase them as follows. 1. Science has to behave like an honest broker who provides alternatives and choices based on scientific evidence. It has to be kept in mind that complete consensus among scientists is rare. Therefore, the different points of view of different scientists have to be clearly presented. Even if consensus on the topic exists among scientists, political decisions are based on finding a balance between conflicting values and interests. 2. Science must not intend to take over political decisions. What science can offer is as much relevant information as possible, but it cannot legitimate the decisions. 3. Framing of a problem influences which aspects are considered important and which disciplines are therefore seen as relevant or not. As an example, it makes a difference whether the pandemic is just seen as a health problem or whether it is seen together with its social, economic, and psychological aspects. In such cases, science has to question the given framing and may have to propose a different one. 4. Global crises need interdisciplinary cooperation among scientific institutions. Such cooperation will need active discussion and not just unconnected statements by single experts. In this way, the results represent an earnest endeavor and can be relied upon by the public. 5. Consensus is not always necessary, especially in crises when exact data are not available and different approaches used. It may be more prudent to present the politicians with these dissenting opinions so that they realize that they are the ones to make the decisions. 6. The public must be helped in understanding how scientific evidence is transformed into expertise among scientists who discuss and interpret this evidence. If this is understood, trust into science is strengthened. 7. Both science and society can profit from communicating scientific deliberations to the public. Discussions of these deliberations enable scientists to pay attention to the topics most relevant for the everyday life of people. On the other hand, the possibilities and limitations of scientific deliberations will be visible. 8. Scientific academies include the most knowledgeable persons in science and can provide most recent and reliable knowledge. They are therefore a trustworthy source of information, especially to find the best experts for a particular topic to form an advisory committee. 9. Scientific academies are competent partners in the discussion of central questions concerning the relation of science, politics, and the public. In the academies, reflection on science itself can be performed. It is important to institutionalize this reflection within the scientific academies. Only science that is strong in research, relevant for advice, and self-critical can be trusted to help society to master the complicated and drawn-out crises of our times. As an example of such self-reflection of science, I mention the Institute of Technology Assessment of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. It evaluates not only uses of current technologies, but also investigates the possible consequences of newly developed ones. The importance of such future-oriented research is obvious when one thinks of the rapid expansion of the use of artificial intelligence, whose consequences are not yet clear, but will be felt by all human beings. Systems based on artificial intelligence can, for instance, help to make decisions in complex cases like medicine or energy management. On the other hand, ethical problems remain. New technologies of this kind are not transparent and are hard to control. They imply risks for human autonomy and privacy. Society will need methods to assure responsible development and use of artificial intelligence technologies. All these questions are addressed by the Austrian Academy's Institute of Technology Assessment. In a more narrow focus on the general theme of this festival, I will mention some of the projects currently undertaken by the Austrian Academy's Committee on the History and Philosophy of Science, which Kostas mentioned before. For example, a project on the history of sociology between the First and Second World Wars in the German-speaking countries is underway. Numerous scholars are already contributing to this project, and a number of conferences will take place to facilitate cooperation. The results will be published in 5 volumes or so. Sociology is well suited to analyze the causes and circumstances of societal crises, of which there were enough during the period covered by this project. Another project of the Academy's Committee on History and Philosophy is engaged with medical humanities. Medical humanities describes the influence of medicine on culture and the arts, and vice versa. This discipline extends the view of medicine beyond its purely scientific nature, especially towards a culturally oriented approach to illness and death. In doing this, it emphasizes the embeddedness of medicine in society. Medical humanities should be worthy of integration into medical research and teaching. Nowadays, medical students hear very little about it. At first sight, these projects concern just details from the history of certain disciplines of the humanities and the sciences. They can, however, shed unexpected light on events that led to veritable crises, both within the scholarly world and in society. The recent corona pandemic is an example. To compare it with the plague of earlier times and what had been done in society then was no help in dealing with corona. History of medicine can show transformations of society accompanying the outbreak of diseases. It can also show how people in the past have tried to find solutions, not just in medicine, but also for its economic, social, and political consequences. Whatever information or even advice is offered by science, decisions always remain the responsibility of politicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Hermann. I think we're doing very well. We have about 19 minutes for discussion. I will ask the audience to write their questions in the Q&A application that you find at the bottom of the screen. Let me raise one issue that Hermann touched upon, and I would like to understand the significance of this issue with respect to what Alexis and Karine said. Hermann talked about artificial intelligence. I would make it into a larger context, which is the digital condition.
Mm-hmm.
And let us very briefly remember what happened during the 19th century. 2 relatively simple technologies, steam and electricity, changed everything. They changed the character of labor. They changed the way wealth was produced. They changed the way cities were run, and they changed the way we communicate. Now, today, with the digital condition, we are faced with exactly these dilemmas. How is labor, the character of labor changing, how wealth is being produced, how cities change, how communications change, etc. Today, we also have something in addition to that, and this is the very deep transformation of the printed word. The printed word and the technology of books have imposed upon us specific ways of reading, specific ways of thinking, specific ways of arguing, etc. Now we don't have this particular technology, and something else is happening. So I wonder, especially with the questions that Alexis raised concerning democracy, Karine about the diversity, and Hermann about the way decisions are taken, whether it will be politicians with the aid of scientists or whatever. How do historians of science who have a very deep understanding of what has happened in the 19th century, how can they reconceptualize their work by trying to get involved with the issue of the digital condition and what the digital condition has brought about? This would be my first question. Alexis?
Thank you, Kostas. Let me just make a very short point about your question, and the only thing that I say is there are two things that I think where we can contribute in general as historians. I think one is showing how false expectations are produced by engineers and scientists. And I think that in the case of artificial intelligence is very obvious. The digital world is going to change everything. It's going to flat the world, and I don't know. We have been there before. That's one point. The second point has to do with my worrying, and as I made a provocation, I'll continue provoking, and I'm going to do that by making a couple of comments about Hermann's talk, which I don't agree with. And I don't agree with in this sense. What I see there is exactly the opposite of what social studies of science and history of science has been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, which is saying that there is a clear distinction between science and scientists and politicians. And what we have seen for many years, and I know Kostas' work very well, I think, and he has shown how thin is this separation, in the sense that scientists, they not only inform the public, they not only inform the politicians, but they make policy. They are policy makers. So I'm not quite sure that the only thing that we have to do is, as scientists, or we have to deal with is how we inform decisions or how we help to understand science, as in a sort of deficit model of public understanding of science is still valid. I think the public, and that's my second point about your question, is that we have to show and we have to recognize that the public not only needs to be helped, the public must be invited to participate explicitly, because it's another epistemic community. It's not in the vacuum that they receive science and technology information. And I think we have to recognize that. And I think that's what we have been doing for several years, trying to show in our works.
Thank you, Alexis. Karine.
First of all, I would like to say how struck I am that the three of us focused on crisis. And I'm also struck by the fact that we all think we can do something as historians of science and technology. And I think that this is a very important issue to pursue. I think that we really need to sit in committees of historians of science and technology who share this conviction and ask ourselves what we can do. So Alexis, for instance, suggested writing a manual. I would like to hear whether he has real concrete ideas about how a manual could help us there. I would be delighted. So either we need to discuss on how to do this, and perhaps before he is given a chance to reply, perhaps what you pointed out, Kostas, in terms of the digital conditions in which we are, is related with this question, because perhaps a manual can be something that is multilingual, that is available online, that is open access. And if we find ways of having an impact, then that would be, but first of all, how to conceive this manual. I'm very interested, but I'm not clear about how to do it. And perhaps action should be taken with people who think that our field can contribute something to do it, because I think the period requires it.
Thank you, Karine. Hermann.
Well,
you can of course respond to what Alexis said as well.
yes, that's what I wanted to, what I feel requested, or what to say. These statements, which were published by the Academy in slightly different words, were done under the impression of the corona pandemic and the rather incoherent reactions both by politicians and by scientists. So they wanted to put down a kind of helpful framework how to see the relations between scientists and politicians. Whether this is really applicable in all kinds of situations is another question. And yes, we have, I think, all seen that scientists in public radio or television spoke in a way that you expect of politicians. So as if they were the ones who knew what to do, not just what the situation is, but also what has to be done. And there is naturally some frictions between these two groups. So I think it came out a little bit too black and white for practical usability.
Okay. I think, by the way, the audience, if they have any question, they should write it at the Q&A application. Alexis said something, and I think both of you also commented not explicitly, and this is this question of false expectations.
Mm-hmm.
it is, I think, even more dangerous than that, in that it is a utopia which comes with every new technology. Mm-hmm. Let us remember what happened with the nuclear reactors in the 50s. And then it was with nanotechnology. And then it was with molecular science. Every time there is a utopia that we are about to approach. And every time things got worse and worse. I mean, there are more poor people today than there used to be. There are more people who get ill because they don't know, what kind of diet they should have, etc., etc. So I think part of this demystification that historians of science and technology will do is try to deconstruct these utopias which come with the new developments. And the second thing is, having been on both sides of politics and science, you will be surprised, you will be shocked of how little politicians care to understand, not how little they understand, how little they care to understand of why scientists have disagreements among themselves. They always think, we'll bring the scientists know the objective world, they have the objective facts, and they'll tell us what to do. And then when they have different views, they cannot understand how to deal with the different views. So what they do, they usually agree with the people they know better. So there is, I think, a very serious issue, which of course one can meet it with education, etc. Alexis talked about all this, but nevertheless, it's a very deep cultural issue in the West. I don't know the other cultures, that the dichotomy between politicians and scientists is very serious when scientists disagree for the right reasons. I mean, we know that disagreements are not always, for bad reasons, but they're for the right reasons. So this is something I would very much like your reactions to bring it down to things that we have all lived, especially during the COVID, but we're still living it in other things. Karine.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to ask ourselves why this is so. And I think this might derive from values that have been attached to science and that people who never worked in science have absorbed, which in fact are values that are a danger for science. Science knows, and if science doesn't know, it means that it's just opinion. Science has the truth, and that is perceived as science is dogmatic. So I think that this is one thing on which we can work. Why does it happen this way, that politicians are completely disoriented when there is disagreement? And it seems to me that this is something we can do in the manual Alexis had in mind. This is something we can do to make people understand better what happens when there is disagreement.
Alexis.
Just a short, thank you, Hermann, for the clarification that actually it was a time in which I also wanted the politicians and the public to listen a little bit more of the scientists. So I want to tame a little bit my criticism.
No problem.
So thank you. I agree. It would be great having more time to discuss it. But I want to just say one word about what Karine asked about the manual. I have no idea. I have no idea how to do it. Maybe showing the diversity, maybe showing good and bad practices, especially about bad practices. We learned a lot about them. And I think, Karine, that we have to invite the division to think about this possibility. but in a way in which I started. And let me put it this way: a provocation is an invitation to work together. That's how I understand a provocation. It's a little bit irresponsible because I don't have it clear exactly, but I think, and I was very skeptical about using the word manual. So you picked the core of the problem that I had in my mind when I wrote this. So I'm not sure, I don't know, but I think we have to do something in that direction. And I hope to have the opportunity to discuss that at length with Kostas, with Lisbeth, with Marcos, etc. It's a humble, but from a pessimistic point of view, I'm very worried, really.
We are all.
You know, I get the impression that you are more of an optimist than what you think you are, because, you know, you put us in front of a lot of...
That's true. I wouldn't be making these proposals, wouldn't be a bit optimistic. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
A pessimist would say, goodbye, I go lock my door in my office and do my work.
It's true. It's true.
Okay. Thank you all. Really, it was a very stimulating discussion. And let us say that we'll meet soon under different circumstances to kind of discuss those things that are becoming more and more pressing.
Okay.
Thank you. And
thank you so much.
We'll meet again.
Thank you.